I think the human race needs to think more about killing, about conflict. Is that what we want in this 21st century?
The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 was the closest the world has ever come to the brink of nuclear war. But how did we get there? Although the United States and the Soviet Union had been allied against Nazi Germany in World War II, the two superpowers disagreed on how to manage newly defeated Germany. Both countries were seeking control of Germany and wanted to spread their own political and social influences. The two became rivals, constantly competing for power. In 1946, with Eastern Europe under Soviet control and influence, Europe was divided into a West Bloc and an East Bloc. This period of conflict, tension, and competition between the Soviet Union and the United States began the Cold War. The nuclear arms race was central to the Cold War. Both the U.S. and the Soviets massively built up their stockpiles of nuclear weapons. In October 1959, as an attempt to stop the spread of communism, the U.S. placed medium-range ballistic Jupiter missiles in Turkey, located approximately 150 miles from the Soviet Union. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, now felt very threatened.
In May of 1960, communism began to spread outside of Europe. The Soviet Union and the new government in Cuba, headed by Fidel Castro, established diplomatic relations. Castro stepped into power in an armed revolution that transformed Cuba into a one-party socialist republic. However, not all of the Cuban citizens embraced the new leadership.
I grew up over there, and we were free like we are in this country until Fidel Castro came and started lying to the Cuban people about what he was, and we used to say like he was like a watermelon because he was wearing a green uniform, but he was red inside.
Cuba's radical communism movement was threatening the Western Hemisphere. In response, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower developed a plan to train Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro and his communist government. Eisenhower's plan was passed to the next president, John F. Kennedy. Inaugurated in January 1961, President Kennedy set in motion Eisenhower's original plan to invade Cuba using 1,400 Cuban exiles in April 1961. This would later be called the Bay of Pigs. Castro's regime was anticipating this invasion and killed or captured most of the exiles. This was a complete failure for the Kennedy administration. With this public U.S. failure, the Soviet Union found an opportunity to expand its communist influence into America's backyard. Because of the conflict with the United States, Fidel Castro opened his nation's doors to Soviet military intervention. The Soviets, anxious to firmly entrench communism in a country approximately 100 miles from the United States, responded enthusiastically and developed a plan to place nuclear missiles in Cuba.
October 16, 1962. President John F. Kennedy was shown photographs taken by the Hazard surveillance flights revealing Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Immediately, President Kennedy formed a secret committee of advisors that would be named EXCOM. EXCOM met in the following days to decide what actions the U.S. should take against the Soviets and Cuba. 1. Political action. 2. Blockade or quarantine on Cuba. 3. Military invasion followed by airstrikes. In the following days, members of EXCOM suggested to blockade ships traveling from the Soviet Union to Cuba. President Kennedy made the decision to blockade Cuba, but called it a quarantine. A blockade, as defined under international treaties, is an act of war. Quarantine is simply an attempt to keep something unwanted out of an area. Almost 200 Navy ships set sail to begin positioning themselves to enforce the quarantine. Military alert was raised to DEFCON 3.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Many Americans, after hearing the news from the president, became concerned for their safety. The president's speech had impressed upon them a great state of danger.
Once we heard Kennedy's speech to the nation, immediately everyone had a lot of concern about the uncertainty and how this would get resolved, particularly about the threat of being attacked with nuclear warheads in the United States. We continued to monitor all that we could on TV, radio, but everyone was concerned, and it became a constant topic of conversation. Well, what happened today? What's going to happen tomorrow?
In the Soviet Union, Premier Khrushchev had received a copy of President Kennedy's speech and was infuriated. He viewed the quarantine of Cuba as an act of war and instructed his ships on the way to Cuba not to stop. The Soviet public was led to believe that the conflict was caused by unjustified U.S. aggression.
We're simple people who just listen whatever they say.
Так говорят так.
Okay.
А веришь и не доверяешь.
We believed, but we never trusted.
І якщо ви розумієте от так, як і навіть сьогодні, то так воно є. Що не все сразу повіриш, да, так,
It's similar as today. We don't believe everything that they say.
In Cuba, Fidel Castro began to anticipate another attack by the United States and ordered the highest degree of alert for the Cuban armed forces. Shortly after the quarantine was put in place, for the first and only time, U.S. military alert was raised to DEFCON 2. For days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war as letters were exchanged between the White House and the Kremlin. Both heads of state searched their mind and soul for their next action.
President Kennedy received an appeal from Premier Khrushchev to resolve the conflict peacefully. Khrushchev agreed to remove his missiles from Cuba if the United States promised to never invade Cuba again. The U.S. was pleased until an unexpected second letter arrived demanding that the U.S. remove their missiles from Turkey as well. President Kennedy decided to send Attorney General Robert Kennedy to meet secretly with Soviet Ambassador Brennan. A compromise was discussed. Robert gave a promise that the U.S. would never invade Cuba and would quietly remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey, but warned that these missiles could not be part of the public compromise. In exchange, the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba immediately. Brennan delivered the message of compromise to Khrushchev. Premier Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missiles in Cuba, and a peaceful compromise had been secured.
Obviously missing from these negotiations was Fidel Castro. He now knew that Cuba had simply been a Cold War pawn. As a result, the primary lesson Cuba drew was that neither superpower could be trusted. By November 1962, the Soviets had begun to dismantle the missiles in Cuba. The following April, the U.S. quietly removed their Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy.
The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a great classroom in which to study the art of conflict management, but there is little agreement on the lessons it holds for us today.
I don't know if we really learned a lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis. We still have nuclear weapons. We continue to make more weapons. Certainly, even though the Soviet Union's gone, the world is a place that, like it always has been, more powerful groups want to conquer less powerful groups and take their territory and take their resources, and I don't know if we have learned a lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis.
46 years later, the former Soviet Union has fallen, Fidel Castro's brother is ruling communist Cuba, and the U.S. is focused on a new enemy, Iraq. In this new war, the United States has again confronted a hostile dictator over nuclear weapons, but this time only two options were offered: humiliating defeat or catastrophic war. Clearly, this conflict will have no compromise without negotiations. We can only hope for the future.